Friends, thank you for being here today. I want to start our conversation by looking at a fundamental, undeniable truth that is almost entirely lost in the noise of modern news cycles and partisan shouting matches. It is a reality of history. National security is, and always has been, entirely dependent on food security. You cannot project power globally, you cannot maintain a dominant military apparatus, and you cannot dictate the terms of the international order if you cannot reliably, consistently, and independently feed your own population. Throughout the centuries, great empires have not fallen solely because of military defeat on foreign battlefields. They have collapsed from within because their agricultural foundations crumbled. Today, we are witnessing a profound geopolitical drama unfolding right here in North America, one that exposes a stark, undeniable contrast between the loud, emotional political bluster of the United States and the quiet, unshakable geological reality of Canada. For decades, the United States has projected an image of absolute, rugged self-sufficiency. It is the narrative that built the American mythos. We hear constant rhetoric about industrial might, energy independence, and the idea that America stands alone as a self-sustaining colossus capable of dictating terms to the rest of the globe. But when we look past the podiums, the press conferences, and the endless campaign rhetoric, the empirical data tells a vastly different, far more vulnerable story. Despite being an undisputed agricultural superpower, the United States is fundamentally, critically dependent on a single external input to sustain the massive crop yields that feed its nation and support its massive economy. That input is potash. Potash, specifically potassium chloride, is not a luxury. It is not an optional additive that a farmer out in Iowa or Nebraska can simply decide to skip for a season to save a few dollars on operating costs. It is the K in the NPK triad of commercial fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Without it, the biology of the crop breaks down. Plants cannot regulate water, they cannot resist disease, their root systems remain shallow and weak, and ultimate crop yields simply collapse. And here is the reality that Washington politicians are loath to admit on national television. The United States of America imports over 90% of its required potash. It is a staggering strategic vulnerability for a nation that currently prides itself on an America First doctrine of independence. Even more revealing is where that vital, non-negotiable resource comes from. Of that massive shortfall, a remarkable 80 to 87% flows directly from one single sovereign nation, Canada. Let that sink in for a moment. The engine of American agriculture, that vast productive heartland that stretches across the Midwest, beats only because of the steady, uninterrupted flow of Canadian resources. Canada possesses the largest, highest quality potash reserves on the planet, estimated at 1.1 billion tons. That is roughly 5 times the reserve capacity of the entire United States. In 2024, Canadian potash mining output was 36 times larger than that of the U.S. This is not some lucky accident of geography. It is a strategic Canadian asset managed with generations of foresight, economic stability, and world-class engineering, primarily in the Elk Point Basin of Saskatchewan. Canada does not need to boast about this dominance on the world stage. The geology speaks for itself, and the math is undisputed. Now, against this backdrop of undeniable geological reality, let us examine the current policy coming out of Washington, a staggering miscalculation that serves as a masterclass in political hubris colliding with the laws of nature. The U.S. administration, driven by a desperate desire to appear tough on trade and deeply committed to a populist isolationist agenda, has repeatedly threatened, and at times actively implemented, very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports. The stated political goal is straightforward enough: to artificially force the reshoring of American fertilizer production and punish what they view as foreign reliance. But to anyone who understands the absolute fundamentals of resource economics, this America First logic is deeply, fatally flawed. It reveals a profound misunderstanding of how global supply chains and heavy industries actually work. You cannot decree a potash mine into existence with an executive order. You cannot close an 87% import gap with a hastily arranged press conference and a signed piece of paper. The reality of resource extraction is brutal and unforgiving. Building a new, large-scale potash mine is not like retrofitting an old car factory to make electric vehicles. It requires up to a decade of rigorous geological surveying, massive environmental permitting battles, complex shaft sinking, and immense infrastructure development. We are talking about billions of dollars in upfront capital before a single ounce of fertilizer leaves the ground. Look at the current efforts championed by U.S. politicians to replace Canadian supply. They point to a facility in Michigan that recently received a massive loan guarantee, yet it still languishes in the feasibility stage. They point to minor exploration grants in Utah expected to produce perhaps 300,000 tons a year. These are statistical rounding errors. They are drops in a vast empty ocean compared to the 5 million tons American farmers consume annually just to maintain their current baselines. Furthermore, the erratic, emotional nature of American trade policy is actively destroying the very domestic investment it claims to encourage. Capital markets demand one thing above all else: certainty. When Washington's trade policy oscillates wildly from month to month, slapping a 25% tariff on Canadian imports in March, panicking and retreating to 10% days later after fierce domestic backlash from their own farmers, offering temporary exemptions under the USMCA, and then turning around and threatening new severe tariffs by December, investors recoil in horror. No rational board of directors will authorize a multi-billion-dollar American mining project when the underlying trade policy environment changes with every news cycle and every late-night social media post. Consequently, the United States achieves the absolute worst of both worlds. It guarantees higher input costs for its citizens today while ensuring absolutely zero meaningful domestic production capacity for tomorrow. But while Washington engages in this theatrical, self-defeating protectionism, what is Canada doing? We are certainly not standing still, and we are not waiting for permission to thrive. Let's widen our lens and look at the broader geopolitical chessboard, because Canada is demonstrating exactly how a mature, resource-rich nation maneuvers in the 21st century. The arrogant American assumption has long been that Canada is a captive supplier, that Canadian producers have absolutely no choice but to sit there and absorb U.S. tariffs because the American Midwest is our only viable customer. That assumption is not just outdated, it is dangerously delusional. Over the past quarter century, Canada has quietly, methodically, and efficiently diversified its global export portfolio. Canadian potash is increasingly feeding the rapidly expanding agricultural sectors of Brazil, China, and Southeast Asia. The most striking symbol of this shift, and a brilliant strategic pivot that should serve as a wake-up call to Washington, is the recent move by Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer based right here in Canada. Nutrien recently announced plans to build a massive new export terminal, but they are not building it in Vancouver or Prince Rupert. They are building it in Washington state. Think about the strategic elegance of that move. Canada's largest agricultural company is utilizing American soil and American port infrastructure to ship Canadian potash away from American farmers, redirecting it to more lucrative, reliable, and expanding markets in South America and Asia. Canada has vast, eager global options. The American corn farmer, trapped by their own government's policy, does not. To fully grasp the sheer absurdity of the current U.S. trade posture, one only has to look at the alternative they have proposed to replace Canadian reliance. In a desperate, flailing attempt to find leverage against Canada, the U.S. administration has engaged in geopolitical gymnastics that border on the surreal. They have actually explored cutting backdoor deals to lift sanctions on Belarus, one of Europe's most entrenched, oppressive authoritarian regimes, in exchange for Belarusian potash. Consider the profound hypocrisy and the strategic bankruptcy of this plan. The United States is apparently willing to threaten its closest democratic ally, its largest trading partner, and its most reliable neighbor, while simultaneously courting a sanctioned dictatorship halfway across the globe, all to avoid admitting a domestic policy failure. But even if we set the glaring moral and political implications aside, The plan is instantly defeated by the cold, hard laws of logistics, geography, and mathematics. Shipping bulk potash from Belarus requires traversing contested Eastern European rail lines, dealing with Baltic port bottlenecks, securing exorbitant maritime insurance in a high-risk zone, and paying for 20,000 kilometers of ocean freight. Once it finally reaches a U.S. port, it must then be offloaded onto domestic rail to reach the interior. Compare that logistical nightmare to the seamless, highly integrated, and vastly cheaper direct rail lines running straight south from the stable, secure mines of Saskatchewan right into the heart of Iowa. The transportation economics of the Belarusian pivot simply do not work. It is a fantasy drafted in a political war room, wholly detached from the reality of global supply chain management. Which brings us to the most tragic irony of this entire situation. Who actually pays the price for this elaborate political theater? It is certainly not the Canadian mining conglomerates. They simply pass the compliance costs along or seamlessly redirect their trains to coastal ports for global export. The immediate, devastating fallout lands squarely on the shoulders of the American family farmer, the exact demographic that forms the core political base of the administration pushing these very policies. Fertilizer is not a marginal expense in agriculture. It accounts for 33 to 44% of the total operating costs for U.S. row crops like corn and soybeans. When the U.S. government slaps a tariff on Canadian potash, it is not taxing Canada. A tariff is, by definition, a domestic consumption tax. Every single dollar collected at the U.S. border is instantly, relentlessly transferred to the balance sheet of the American farmer, driving their input costs to thoroughly unsustainable levels. This creates a brutal, self-inflicted wound. American farmers are currently being crushed in a vice of their own government's making. On one side, their costs are skyrocketing due to punitive tariffs on vital Canadian inputs. On the other side, their crop revenues are plummeting because foreign markets, most notably China, have aggressively slashed their purchases of U.S. soybeans and corn in direct retaliation for the broader American trade wars. The ultimate failure of this policy is measured in the sheer volume of taxpayer money required to mask the economic damage. To prevent a total catastrophic collapse of their agricultural sector, the U.S. government has been forced to issue record-breaking bailouts. We are talking about $23 billion in trade aid during the previous tariff spat, and programs now reaching up to $40 billion in total farm payments. This is the deep, inescapable irony of the current American strategy. A policy explicitly designed to build rugged, capitalistic independence has instead created a system of permanent, Soviet-style, state-subsidized dependence. The U.S. is essentially taxing its own farmers at the border, destroying their global export markets through diplomatic aggression, and then writing them massive government checks drawn from the public treasury just to keep the banks from foreclosing on their land. And eventually, this systemic inefficiency trickles down to every single American citizen in the form of sticky, persistent food inflation at the grocery store. The price of every loaf of bread, every box of cereal, and every cut of meat in America now carries the hidden tax of this failed geopolitical posturing. To truly understand the depth of this American miscalculation, we must recognize that this potash dispute is not an isolated incident. It is merely a symptom of a deeply entrenched, highly predictable pattern of behavior emanating from Washington. We have seen this exact playbook utilized before, and we, as Canadians, know exactly how it inevitably ends. Consider the decades-long disputes over softwood lumber, or the more recent emotionally charged tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, which were imposed under the frankly absurd guise of national security threats. In every single instance, the cycle is identical. Politicians in Washington, desperate to project a facade of strength to a riled-up domestic audience, impose artificial, heavy-handed barriers on superior Canadian resources. They step up to the podium and declare a resounding victory for American industry. But within months, the ironclad laws of economics take over, and the facade crumbles. American homebuilders, suddenly starved of affordable, high-quality Canadian lumber, are forced to pass skyrocketing construction costs directly onto American families trying to buy their first home. American automobile and appliance manufacturers, suddenly burdened by artificially expensive domestic steel, lose their competitive edge on the global market. The American consumer ultimately bears the absolute brunt of their own government's protectionist bluster, while Canadian industries simply adapt, innovate, and find new, more reliable avenues for international growth. The current potash situation is merely the latest chapter in a very long, very repetitive book of American trade failures. They are attempting to apply a clumsy 19th century protectionist hammer to a 21st century highly integrated, geologically dictated supply chain. I want to pause here for a second and ask you all a question. For those of you who lived through the softwood lumber battles or watched the steel and aluminum tariffs unfold, does this sound familiar? Let me know in the comments below if you are seeing the exact same historical cycle play out today. I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this recurring pattern. We must also look much closer at the sheer scale of the collateral damage currently unfolding just south of our border. The pain of these tariffs does not magically stop at the edge of the farmer's field. It bleeds deeply into the very foundation of the American rural economy. When a soybean farmer in Nebraska or a corn grower in Kansas is forced to pay a massive government-imposed premium on Canadian potash, they do not simply absorb that cost in a vacuum. They are forced to make immediate, devastating financial decisions. They delay the purchase of a new tractor or a $500,000 combine harvester. Suddenly, major American agricultural equipment manufacturers, the legendary, iconic industrial giants of the Midwest, report plunging quarterly sales. They are subsequently forced to lay off union workers on their assembly lines in places like Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio. The ripple effect only accelerates from there. Local community banks, the absolute lifeblood of rural America, recognize the massive artificial government-imposed risk hanging over their agricultural clients and immediately tighten their credit lines. Seasonal farmhands are let go. The local diner sees fewer customers during the morning rush. The county hardware store struggles to move inventory. And eventually, the municipal tax base that funds the rural public schools, the local fire departments, and the county hospitals begins to severely wither and shrink. This is the ultimate, tragic irony of the entire situation. The politicians in Washington who champion these tariffs loudly claim they are protecting the American heartland, yet their economic illiteracy is actively, systematically hollowing out the very rural communities that voted them into office in the first place. They are destroying the village in a misguided, desperate attempt to save it. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe the average American voter actually understands just how deeply dependent their own food supply is on Canadian resources? Drop a comment and tell me what you think, because the massive disconnect between Washington's rhetoric and the reality on the ground is simply staggering. And while the United States engages in this myopic, inward-looking self-destruction, we must recognize the vastly more important role that Canada is currently stepping into on the world stage. As the global population continues its relentless climb toward 10 billion people, and as the amount of arable land per capita inevitably shrinks due to rapid urbanization and shifting climate patterns, the agricultural efficiency of every single acre on this planet becomes a matter of absolute life and death. In this stark reality, Canada is not merely a vendor of a raw commodity. We are the quiet, reliable stewards of global food security. When the rapidly growing nations of Southeast Asia need to aggressively increase their crop yields to feed their booming middle classes, they do not look to the erratic, unpredictable political theater of Washington. They look to the deep, stable, endlessly productive mines of Saskatchewan. When Brazil continues to aggressively expand its massive agricultural frontier to meet surging global demand, it relies intrinsically on a steady, unbroken pipeline of Canadian potassium. We are quite literally providing the foundational building blocks of human survival. Furthermore, there is a profound technological and environmental reality that the United States administration completely ignores in its chaotic rush toward artificial self-sufficiency. Canadian potash mining is not just massive in scale, it is the most technologically advanced, stringently environmentally regulated, and highly efficient extraction apparatus anywhere on the globe. We have spent decades refining our industrial processes, investing billions in sustainable mining practices, drastically reducing our water usage, and minimizing our carbon footprint per ton of output. Contrast this reality with the desperate American alternatives. To hastily bootstrap a viable domestic potash industry, the United States would inevitably have to bypass its own environmental regulations, fast-track highly disruptive mining permits in ecologically sensitive areas, and heavily subsidize intensely inefficient carbon-heavy operations. Or, as previously noted, they would be forced to turn to regimes like Belarus, importing fertilizer with a massive, dirty supply chain and a horrendous carbon footprint. Canada offers clean, highly efficient, completely reliable, and ethically sourced agricultural inputs. The United States, in its stubborn, prideful refusal to accept the reality of our mutual reliance, appears willing to sacrifice its own environmental standards and its own economic efficiency just to score a few fleeting political points on cable news. It is the triumph of pure political ego over practical, responsible governance. Given all of this, the bluster, the economic self-harm next door, the shifting global markets, how should we, as Canadians, respond to this erratic behavior from our neighbor to the south? The answer is exactly how we have been responding, with calm, rational, and resolute statecraft. There are always reactionary voices, even within our own borders, suggesting we should stoop to their level. There have been loud calls from some political corners in Canada to weaponize our potash supply, to completely embargo the United States, and to aggressively leverage our critical resources to inflict economic pain and force Washington's hand. But our leadership, particularly the steady, pragmatic hands governing Saskatchewan, has wisely rejected the politics of retaliation. They understand that to weaponize trade is to introduce the very instability that is currently destroying American agriculture. We do not need to match the emotional, loud, and unpredictable aggression of U.S. politics. In fact, doing so would be a massive strategic error on our part. Canada's true power lies in its unshakable stability. By maintaining a steady, reliable, and rules-based approach to international trade, we stand in stark, brilliant contrast to the chaos emanating from Washington. We prove our absolute superiority as a global trading partner, not by yelling the loudest on television, but by consistently delivering the critical goods the world desperately needs. We honor our contracts. We respect the rule of law. We let the undeniable forces of economics, geography, and geology do the heavy lifting. This ongoing dispute over potash is so much more than just a regional trade disagreement. It is a definitive masterclass in modern geopolitics. It proves once and for all that raw political aggression, protectionist bluster, and emotional policymaking cannot overwrite the fundamental laws of nature and economics. You simply cannot bully a mineral deposit into existence. You cannot tariff your way out of a massive geological deficit. Canada holds the winning hand, and we know it. We do not need to pound our fists on the table or issue midnight threats. Through the quiet, unshakable power of our natural wealth, the sophisticated brilliance of our logistics, and the steady adult governance of our resources, we secure our absolute sovereignty and our long-term economic future. We will continue to quietly feed the world, expanding our reach across oceans, while leaving those who chose the path of political hubris to balance their own depleted checkbooks and pay the inevitable heavy price for their own short-sightedness. If you found this analysis valuable and you believe more people need to understand the true strength of the Canadian position, please share this video with a friend or a neighbor. But most importantly, I want to hear from you. Head down to the comment section right now. Do you agree that Canada's best weapon is our quiet, unshakable stability, or is there a part of you that wants to see us play hardball with our resources? Let's start a real conversation down below. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your time.